At its peak, one empire ruled over a quarter of the Earth's landmass. It spanned continents. It governed over 458 million people. And it left behind a legacy of glory, brutality, innovation, and resistance. This is the story of how a small island in the North Atlantic, Great Britain, came to rule the largest empire the world has ever seen. This is the rise, dominance, and fall of the British Empire. Chapter 1: Humble Beginnings. In the late 15th century, Britain was not yet a global power. Spain and Portugal dominated the seas. Their explorers had carved empires in the Americas. But England, newly unified and ambitious, watched closely. By the reign of Elizabeth I, privateers like Francis Drake and explorers like Walter Raleigh were paving the way for overseas ambitions. In 1600, the East India Company was formed, a private company with a royal charter to trade in Asia. Unknowingly, it would become the spearhead of British imperialism. Chapter 2: Colonies and Commerce. The 17th century saw Britain's empire begin to take shape. The American colonies, from Virginia to Massachusetts, became vital sources of tobacco, cotton, and trade wealth. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations fueled economic growth, built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Britain was now part of the Atlantic slave trade. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol grew rich, while human lives were trafficked across oceans. But profit funded power. The Royal Navy grew. Trade expanded. And slowly, Britain started to outpace her European rivals. Chapter 3: India, the Jewel in the Crown. While American colonies fought for independence in the 18th century, Britain's eyes turned eastward. In India, the East India Company acted more like a government than a business. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the company controlled Bengal. Within decades, it ruled large parts of the subcontinent. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, its vast population and resources crucial to imperial wealth. But exploitation ran deep. Heavy taxation, famines, and rebellion brewed beneath the surface. Chapter 4: Expansion through War. From the Napoleonic Wars to the Scramble for Africa, Britain expanded through conflict. Victories over France gave Britain control of Canada, parts of the Caribbean, and strategic naval ports. The Industrial Revolution supercharged British dominance. Steamships, railways, and telegraphs connected the empire like never before. By 1850, Britain independence mounted. Yet amid repression, reform emerged. The abolition of slavery in 1833. Railways built across India. Missionaries, administrators, and scholars claimed to bring civilization. But beneath the surface lay exploitation and control. Chapter 6: Pax Britannica and the Age of Empire. By the 19th century, Britain emerged as the undisputed global superpower. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 ushered in a period historians call Pax Britannica, British peace. With the Royal Navy unrivaled and global commerce expanding, Britain acted as both policeman and profiteer of the seas. Free trade, railroads, and telegraph cables tied the empire's distant edges to London's financial heart. From Canada to the Caribbean, and Australia to Africa, British influence spread in a grid of control, economic domination backed by military might. British banks funded railways in Argentina, tea flowed from Ceylon, and opium forced open the gates of China. But nothing symbolized British dominance more than India, the empire's glittering prize. Chapter 7: The Jewel in the Crown, British rule in India. India was not just a colony, it was a civilizational conquest. After the Battle of Plassey, 1757, the British East India Company became a ruling power. By the early 1800s, they administered vast territories, collecting taxes, building railways, and extracting resources. India became the empire's largest source of wealth: cotton, indigo, tea, and labor. But beneath the glitter of British control simmered discontent. In 1857, Indian soldiers, sepoys, rose in rebellion. The Indian Mutiny, or First War of Independence, was brutally suppressed, but it changed everything. The British Crown dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct rule in 1858. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. India was now the centerpiece of a global empire. But with empire came contradiction, railways and famine, law and racism, modernization and exploitation. Chapter 8, Africa Carved, the Scramble and the Suffering. While India stood as a symbol of control, Africa became the canvas of ambition. In the late 1800s, the British joined other European powers in the scramble for Africa. By the Berlin Conference of 1884, Europe carved up the continent without African input. Britain seized control of Egypt in 1882, claiming the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline to India. Further south, Cecil Rhodes dreamed of a railway stretching from Cape to Cairo. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain held Egypt and Sudan, Kenya and Uganda, Nigeria and Ghana, South Africa and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Though infrastructure and education expanded, colonial rule dismantled African sovereignty. Indigenous systems were crushed, and resistance met with massacre, from the Zulu Wars to the brutal suppression in Kenya. Chapter 9, Colonies of Settlement, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Not all parts of the empire were ruled in the same way. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the British transplanted their society. These were colonies of settlement, not just exploitation. British settlers arrived in waves, displacing indigenous populations like the Aboriginal Australians and the Maori. Despite native resistance, the British built dominions, self-governing territories that remained loyal to the crown. These dominions sent soldiers, paid taxes, and flew the Union Jack, but with increasing autonomy. They were white settler colonies, linked by shared language, culture, and belief in British superiority. Chapter 10, The Imperial Mindset, Culture, Class, and Control. The British Empire wasn't just a political structure, it was a global ideology. Missionaries spread Christianity. Administrators enforced English law. Schools taught Shakespeare and Newton. British culture, cricket, tea time, Queen and country, was exported globally. London saw itself as the civilizing force in a world of natives. But this so-called civilizing mission was steeped in racism and paternalism. Colonial subjects were expected to serve, not rule. And when they resisted, the empire responded with violence, as seen in the Amritsar Massacre, 1919, where hundreds of Indian civilians were gunned down by British troops. Empire was, ultimately, about control. Even as Victorian Britain prided itself on liberalism at home, it ruled through force abroad. Subscribe to Thrones of Time for more epic deep dives into the empires, betrayals, and legends that shaped our world. Chapter 11, The World at War, Britain's Global Fight. By the early 20th century, the British Empire stood at its zenith. Over 400 million people lived under the Union Jack, across every continent. But storm clouds gathered. In 1914, Europe plunged into the First World War. And Britain, with its global empire, brought the world with it. Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and Africa. Troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa fought and died in British uniform. Britain's colonies became battlefields and supply lines. Though the Allies emerged victorious, the empire was shaken. Economically drained. Morally questioned. Politically unstable. Promises of greater autonomy to colonial subjects were largely broken. And the seeds of anti-colonial nationalism began to bloom. Chapter 12, The Interwar Struggle, Nationalism Rises. Between the wars, movements for independence gained strength. In India, the Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, launched non-violent resistance against British rule. In Ireland, rebellion led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. In Egypt and Iraq, nationalist uprisings were met with force, but change was coming. Britain struggled to hold on, using political reform, co-option, and often brutal suppression to maintain control. But beneath the surface, the imperial foundation was cracking. Chapter 13, World War II, Empire's Last Stand. In 1939, Britain once again faced global war, this time against the Axis powers. The empire mobilized once again. Millions of colonial soldiers fought across North Africa, Europe, and Asia. But Britain emerged from World War II victorious yet broken. Its economy was shattered. Its colonies were restless. And two new superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, now dominated global politics. Most importantly, the war shattered the myth of white supremacy and imperial invincibility. The world was no longer willing to be ruled by an empire built on inequality. Chapter 14, The Winds of Change, Decolonization begins. In 1947, Britain faced its greatest colonial turning point, the independence of India and Pakistan. After centuries of exploitation, division, and resistance, the jewel in the crown was lost. Partition led to chaos, over 1 million deaths, and the largest mass migration in human history. India's independence inspired others. Across Asia and Africa, national liberation movements surged. Ghana gained independence in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah. Kenya fought the Mau Mau uprising, achieving independence in 1963. Nigeria followed in 1960. Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Burma, Myanmar, broke free. British rule was retreating, not in triumph, but in pragmatic surrender. Chapter 15, Suez Crisis, The End of Global Power. In 1956, Britain joined France and Israel in an invasion of Egypt, aiming to retake the nationalized Suez Canal. But the United States and USSR forced Britain to withdraw. It was a humiliating moment, proof that Britain was no longer a global superpower. The Suez Crisis marked the symbolic end of British imperial dominance. From here on, Britain's role would be smaller, secondary, and increasingly dependent on American leadership. Chapter 16, The Empire Becomes a Commonwealth. As colonies became nations, the British government sought a new framework, the Commonwealth of Nations. It was an attempt to preserve relationships, trade, and cultural ties, without direct rule. Former colonies like India, Canada, Australia, Nigeria, and Jamaica joined. The Queen remained head of the Commonwealth, a symbol, not a sovereign. Sporting events like the Commonwealth Games replaced imperial rituals. Yet for many, memories of empire remained painful, marked by trauma, economic scars, and unhealed wounds. Chapter 17, The Last Colony, Hong Kong's Handover. The British Empire formally came to an end in 1997. That year, Hong Kong, Britain's last major colony, was handed over to China, after 156 years of colonial rule. It was the final chapter in a saga that had once claimed a quarter of the earth. There were no wars, no battles, only a quiet ceremony. But the symbolism was profound. An empire built on conquest had faded into history. Legacy of the British Empire. The British Empire no longer exists, but its echoes still shape our world. English remains a global language. Legal, political, and educational systems bear its imprint. Borders drawn by colonial rulers still fuel conflict and identity crises. And the debate over reparations, statues, and colonial crimes continues. The empire brought railways and repression, trade and trauma, law and loot. It was the largest empire in human history, one that ruled by sea, by sword, and by story. And while its sun may have set, the shadow it left behind remains. Pushpin subscribe to Thrones of Time for more epic stories of kings, conquests, and forgotten legacies.